Right, so for a slow start then. Well, welcome everyone to this IFPO webinar on ethics for the private security officer. My name is Peter Stiernstedt and I am a lecturer in criminology at the University of West London. In my capacity as an academic, I have written quite a few pieces around private security officers and their challenges in various forms, including regulation, which actually sometimes comes quite in friction or in contrast with what may be perceived as the ethical and the moral good. I am also on the advisory board of IFPO UK, which is obviously an organization that takes the various challenges of the private security officers very seriously and wants to address every single angle and explore the nooks and cracks of that profession. To that end, I am joined today with two prominent people that I would let introduce themselves in a bit. It's Professor Mark Button from the University of Portsmouth, and it's also Abbey there, who's listed as Mike Hurst, but that's, yeah. Anyway, so I will let you introduce yourself. So over to you, Mark.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Professor Mark Button. I have well over 25 years now been researching the private security industry. I originally started in this world as an actual security guard when I was a student, so I've got some insights from a practical perspective as well. But I then went on to work for Bruce George, who was a member of Parliament, some of you may know of, who was the kind of inspiration and key advocate in regulation of the private security industry. I moved on from there to academia, where I've been stuck and carried on researching this area, and I've written numerous books and articles around this area. That's probably enough from me.
Abbey.
Hi, I'm Abbey Petkar, not Mike Hurst, though looks like I'm called Mike Hurst on this screen. For some reason, I'm not sure why, but I definitely am Abbey Petkar, and I've been around the security industry for the last 35 years. I also started off as a security officer many, many years ago and worked for major security companies before setting up my own security company some 26 years ago. We're a multi-award winning company, very much about getting the best jobs that we can for our security officers, paying the best rates, giving them best benefits, and making sure their well-being is looked after.
Right, thank you very much for that. As always, should you in the audience have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A or in the chat there, and we will try to address them as they come in and as we go along. Okay, let me get started with a very open and possibly very easy question, but I will give you each an opportunity to, in just a minute or so, to encapsulate whether or not there is an ethical dimension or an ethical challenge for the private security officer, and what that primarily would mean for someone who perhaps wouldn't really immediately see those challenges for a private security officer at the front line. So I will start with Abbey for that question. What is the ethical dimension for the private security officer?
I think there's quite a few ethical challenges for security officers these days. If we start right at the beginning, our industry is almost split into two. We have two tiers. We have those companies that are professional and do an excellent job, and we have those that I call rogue operators who don't pay their staff wages in the correct manner. We've still got rogue operators paying cash in hand, not giving benefits. So the ethical dilemma for a security officer is, first of all, who do they work for? Do they work for the professional companies? Do they work for unprofessional companies? And then once they've decided on that, then there are lots of other ethical issues that they need to address. The loyalty to their employer, the loyalty to their customer. So there's quite a few. And the list could go on for quite a long time. You've only given me a minute, so I obviously can't cover them all.
Mark, any thoughts on the ethical dimension?
Yeah, I would agree with Abbey on I think that is one of the first key decisions. And then once they've put their uniform on and they're working, I think security guards face potentially a wide range of different types of ethical dilemmas. And we saw only a few weeks ago at the final of the football, the European Championship football, of allegations of security staff and stewards potentially taking bribes to let people in. Security operatives are often forgotten when we talk about bribery as too low down the pecking order. But I know from my own experience of when I was a security guard, there are opportunities to do potentially the wrong thing, for money or for other reasons. So there will be lots of situations, I think, where security guards will be put in positions where someone might seek to want to get access to a particular sensitive location or a prestigious location, and they might be offered some kind of favor or some kind of potential benefit to let that person through those gates. So just on a very practical level, I think, and those working will no doubt be able to think of lots of these types of examples where if you are a unethical person, there are lots of potential situations where you could exploit. So as I've only got a minute, I'll end there. But I think that's a very kind of important area.
Right, and on that, I would like to open this up to anyone. And I just saw that the instruction is put all the questions in the Q&A. If there's anyone listening in today, I'm not in that different time zone, that has an experience or a question or an idea of a situation where we would perhaps be faced as private security officers, frontline primarily, with ethical dilemmas, please put them in there and we will address them. I will begin by putting a small comment on Mark's opening statement there, that there's obviously situations where private security officers are faced with an opportunity to do, as you said, the wrong thing, accepting a bribe and so on. But I think we will try now to explore a few examples of scenarios where the question is whether or not they're doing the right thing and what the right thing is. And I'm going to start with a classic example. There's an example that the well-read viewer will obviously recognize from one of the papers that I've written together with Mark. So there's a bit of a bias here that should be disclosed. But the example nevertheless holds and provides an interesting challenge, if you like. And it goes something like this. You have a frontline security officer who is at his or her post. I'm going to use his because I'm going to do it from, I guess, my own perspective. So he is positioned at in a fixed location which he cannot leave, and he obviously has duties to maintain security at that particular post. Now there's something happening that beckons his attention just across the street, and we don't have to specify exactly what that is, but that could be a person in need. Everything from a woman in labor to a car accident, and there seems to be something going on across the street. So let's see now, let's begin with this first stage dilemma. We're in the situation, we're at our post, we're not allowed to leave it, but now we're seeing something across the street which would require our help. What do we do? Mark?
Yeah, this is a very common dilemma, I think. And I think obviously you've got to look at the particular circumstances of the location that you are working from. So first of all, let's imagine it's a very important location, an MOD establishment or a government office, and you are the lone guard. That if you left your position, you may open up the opportunity, if it was a kind of a setup for someone to then be able to get into that location. I think in that situation it's much more difficult, and I think we obviously all have mobile phones now, and a lot of guys have radios. I think in that situation I would be very careful not to leave my post. But let's imagine if it's something which isn't quite as sensitive, let's say it's a kind of shopping center, but your assignment instructions are that you must stay on post. But you can see there's something quite serious going on where there is no one helping. I think in that situation, even though my entitlement instructors might say, don't leave your post, if you leave your post in that situation, I don't think it's going to cause a major risk of a potential disaster or security breach. So I would probably be more open to exploring what was going on and seeing if there's something I could help in that situation. So I think I would be guided by my particular post and my particular security situation and what I could do. So that would be my answer.
Abbey?
So I agree with Mark, but the first thing to do is to refer back to what the assignment instructions say. I started off this conversation with ethical dilemma of working for a professional company and working for a non-professional company. Now, a professional company will have proper standards, proper instructions for the officer to follow. What are officers normally told to do? They're told to observe, make note of what's going on, call out the emergency services. Those are the things they would do first before attempting to get involved themselves. But it is site critical. If you've got a site that is vulnerable, and criminals aren't adverse to creating these scenarios and then expecting the officer to leave his post, leaving his site vulnerable and making that a target for crime. So it is really down to the individual set of circumstances. So let me give you a working example. I had this last week. One of our officers was in a hotel location, and somebody outside the hotel was having a heart attack. Our staff are first aid trained. So the first thing he did was to call our control room and say, I'm dealing with an emergency and can I get some backup? So the nearest mobile supervisor was alerted, so he could go to site to assist him. The customer was made aware, and then he proceeded to give first aid to the individual that was having a heart attack until the ambulance arrived, saved that individual's life. This is what the ambulance crew said. If you hadn't reacted the way you did, this could be a much more severe situation. But in all of that time, other people were made aware, so they could then, if you like, view the situation and keep an eye on what would be going on. And my advice is to any security officer, speak to your control room. If you're working for a reputable company, they're going to have a control room. They should know what's going on. They should make sure people are aware of the situation, be it a local mobile supervisor, be it a security officer that you work with who may be in a different part of that site. That's what I would suggest. But, security officers and the security industry is here to help the public. So wherever we're in a public environment, we are seen as someone that can help in a scenario where there is an emergency. And we are mindful of that. Our assignment instructions say that, but you should not put your site at risk at the same time. I mean, primarily, the customer is paying for the service for the officer to be there. So, and from an insurance perspective, also, if the officer leaves his post and there is an incident, the insurance will come back to the security company and say, well, he left his post. He shouldn't have done. That's not what he's employed to do. So the moral dilemma is, do you assist? And my answer is, assist wherever you can without risking the site that you're working on.
But to kind of push the envelope here a bit then, you could argue that leaving your post is by definition an increase of risk. So you say assist, but do not risk the security of your location. But then you could say, well, I didn't do anything because I didn't want to risk my location.
You're right, but this is why a professional company would have a proper set of assignment instructions, so you know what your responsibilities are and what your parameters are. So if you've got other people on site, let's say I gave you a scenario of a hotel. There are other people within the hotel that could man your post or keep an eye on your post while you are dealing with this emergency, because ultimately, you want to save someone's life if that situation occurred. That should be primary in your thought. But as a professional security organization, you also have to be mindful about the risks you're taking for the customer that's paying you to be there. So there is a fine line between what you can do and what you should do from a moral standpoint.
So I think you're kind of both advocating for an assist here. So let's look at some potential scenarios here. I mean, let's stay away from the situation where you're guarding some sort of a critical infrastructure, because obviously that's arguably a bit different. I think it would be easier to excuse someone who didn't leave their post in such a situation. But let's say you're guarding a hotel. There's lots of staff there that could kind of cover, if you'd like, for your absence, or you may be guarding the entrance to a construction site is actually locked, and you're just there to make sure that no one's really entering and no one there. So it's low risk situation. In those cases, we're looking at pretty much the advice, if you like, to go and assist. So let's look at two possible consequences here. And the first one is this, and I'm going to present them in turn. So the first one is this. You do leave your post, and it is considered a low risk by you and arguably anyone who objectively views this. But then something happens nevertheless. In the construction sites, some kids climb the fence and then gets hurt on some of sharp machinery on the inside. In the hotel scenario, you leave your post, and well, lo and behold, there is someone. There's a theft that you should have perhaps been able to prevent if you were there. Something happens. No need to specify, but something does happen. Now, do you still think that the guard will be able to kind of, whether they will be able to morally escape from this is obviously certain. But what about the legal liabilities and consequence of this? If you'd like to expand on what those could be, and I can go back to Abbey first here this time.
The legal standpoint is quite clear. You are legally responsible for that site. Anything that happens to that site while you are in situ falls on the shoulders of the security provider, not the security officer, the security provider, which is why we have insurance cover. So, you could argue that you were doing something which is morally correct, but insurers very rarely think of what is morally correct. They think of what is financial cost, and wherever they can offset that cost, they will do so. So if somebody broke into a site, then the responsibility falls on the security provider. It's as simple as that. And in all my years of working within this industry, I've never come across an insurance provider that says, that was morally correct, don't worry about a claim. There's always going to be a claim.
Mark?
Yeah, it's a very difficult dilemma, really. And I think, it's obviously what is legally and ethically appropriate for the organization, and what would be kind of ethically appropriate for yourself. So imagine you stay on site, there's a gentleman having a heart attack over the other side of the road, and he dies, and your first aid trade, and you could have potentially saved that person. I think if that was me, and I'd say I'd done the right thing for the company, and the kind of I think that would weigh on me, the fact that I could have saved someone's life. So I think it is a big dilemma, and a situation like that, it may not be the most appropriate thing for the company to do, but I think if there is a kind of clear issue of life. So we're talking about life here, not, if it's someone breaking into a car or something like that, then it's quite simple. You call the police, and if they get away, they get away. But I think when it gets to an issue of potentially saving someone's life, in that situation, I think for me personally, that's probably what I would do.
Excellent. I mean, I think I must address some of the chat comments here and put those into the conversation, because they are beautiful. The first one here is from Colonel Ravi Baldoa. Apologies for pronunciations. The key lies in making the logical right choice in the good time. And it just reminds me of rational choice theory, right? How to make a rational choice, how to make that logical choice. You need to have all the information, which is obviously never possible. You need to be able to process that information, which is obviously never possible. You need to have time to process that information, which rarely is the case, which makes all of these decisions flawed in some sense. So, and it's highly subjective. You say, well, it has to be about life. Well, Mark, that's your opinion, right? What about someone who thinks that breaking into someone's Porsche is reason enough for me to leave my low risk? It leaves open for a subjective level of decision making here, and perhaps you feel, my company that I work for, and going back to Abbey's comment, they have insurance, so I'm fine. I'm going to do what I believe is right, and then, as I said, there's always going to be a claim. So who cares? As long as I'm doing what I believe is morally right. But now highly subjective and not very prescriptive. Interestingly, I was going to read one more comment here. In Australia, Mark, go comment.
I was just going to throw in, but sort of think about it from this other perspective. Let's imagine that the person over the road dies. There's a woman shouting, and she's shouted at me as a security guard. Come and help this guy. And I stay on post, and the gentleman dies. Think of the newspaper coverage. How bad that would be for the company. Security guard lets man die, won't leave his post. So I think that's another dimension to think about for the security. And I don't know what Abbey would think about that.
Let's Abbey address that one.
Yeah.
The point I was making about where responsibility lies, I have never yet discouraged a security officer from helping somebody who is considering either taking their own life or having a heart attack. We have got a whole file of individuals that we've been commending for doing a fantastic job when they've come across people trying to commit suicide, talking them down, saving their lives. But the question was where the responsibility lies. And what I'm saying is, in the real world, the responsibility lies with the security company. I would never, and up to now have never done so, to hold the officer responsible for leaving post and going to help somebody who is, as I said, going to lose their life because of a heart attack or trying to commit suicide. What I'm saying, though, is you have to be mindful of the risk, because we do have criminals that have a brain and will try and create a diversion in order to break into sites. So we need to be mindful of that. But going back to everything I said from the beginning, professional security companies have procedures in place for this. They have backup in place for this. So if you work for a reputable company and you call the control room, automatically procedures are put into place to support that officer, create support from mobile supervisors that are local, security officers that might be local to the site. So there's a whole array of procedure that's put in place as soon as the button has been hit. So I'm all about saving people's lives. We've been doing this day in, day out. We've had many occasions where, especially in the last 18 months, where people have tried to jump off bridges, slash their wrists. I've even had an officer who had somebody slash their wrist, and he was holding their wrist to stop the blood flow, waiting for an ambulance to arrive. So, I want to clarify, life is life and it comes first, but there is also the element of risk to the customer and to the corporate company providing the service, if they're professional.
Two things here. Again, from the comments here. In Australia, bystander security or not are not required to assist. So it is a moral question. I think that's kind of where we are here. But it's quite interesting to see, because one of the comments here goes, the ultimate responsibility is to take care of the assigned duty first. And then immediately after, there's a comment that says human life first. Right? So there is obviously a dilemma here. What do you prioritize, and where does your allegiance, if you like, morally and practically lie? Right. So now on to another scenario here. Then we're going to bring this a bit further, because there's obviously bad publicity, as Mark points out, possibly that even if you do the, if you'd like, then from the duty perspective, you do the right thing. You stay on your post, you protect your area, and you do that well. And then something happens across the street. This is recorded in this day and age. There's a whole big media hoopla that goes, security guard does nothing whilst woman dies across the street. Right? Horrible headings. But now, let's go one step further. Now the security guard runs over to help this woman. And you said your staff is first aid trained, which is great, and RB all are. But let's say that in this case they were not trained enough, because in many countries and in many situations the training of private security guards is abysmal and non-existent. And they go over and they make things worse. So in effect, the headings could go: security guard runs over and kills woman, or delivers babies, stillborn baby, due to security guard being inept. And that could also be some bad publicity. Abbey, I will go to you first. What about that? The training requirement or the competence to actually be able to act on such a not a part of their normal duty?
Well, as I said before, the first thing they need to do is to contact emergency services so that there's somebody on the way who is professional to do what needs to be done. And then if they are attending to somebody who is has had a heart attack or something similar, they can do their best. But there is a risk. There's always going to be a risk. And that risk is that, yes, they do something wrong. In my time in this industry, you got to take publicity with a pinch of salt, good or bad, right? Because at the end of the day, you get both types. As long as you can justify what you've done and why you've done it, that's the more important thing. And if you're talking about someone's life, then that is key. You've got to try and protect life wherever that situation arises. So to me, I would rather have somebody try and attend and do something than do nothing. And then I'll deal with the legal issue at a later stage, or the press issue at a later stage. The first thing has to be priority to save the life of the person that's in that predicament. And even if you're not qualified, you can still do certain things, like when you call in emergency services, give them information about what you're seeing, so that they can get the appropriate help to that individual. Whether they get one of those paramedics on a motorbike because it's a higher category condition than otherwise would have been informed to them. So it is about making the right choices at the time. You're never going to make 100% choices because people's adrenaline kicks in and things happen that shouldn't happen. But it's difficult to try and explain that in this sort of scenario, because when you are there, it is a completely different environment. I've had officers come back to me saying, you know what, my training worked. I remembered at the time I needed to what I had to do. And that's brilliant. And that's the best scenario you can have. But that's not always the case. You could train people to the hilt and still they wouldn't remember a thing when they're pushed into that scenario because of adrenaline.
Mark, your thoughts on the training requirements and that, the competence?
Yeah, I agree absolutely with Abbey. I think in the circumstances, you call the emergency services, and often they will advise you what to do. So even if you aren't trained appropriately, you don't know what to do, they can guide you. But I think you obviously should try and do something to the best of your knowledge and abilities, but ideally with the help and support of someone who does know what they're doing on the other end of the line. But I think it does raise the kind of important issue, and it's very good to hear that Abbey's company, his guards are first aid trained, and I think all security guards should be first aid trained. I think they play a very important part in society, and to not have them trained to a suitable standard, I think is a gap.
So going back again,
to add to that then, Peter, that the SIA has taken this on board, and as of later on this year, anyone renewing their license also has to have the first aid training qualification. So that is a good thing in my view, because having a license is one thing, but having the additional qualifications to enhance what you do is primary in my view.
Yeah.
So I'm just spinning off some comments here in the chat here. To Abbey then, do you have this clearly stated in your protocols for your security officers? Do they know this? Is this written out in?
Yes, we have this information in the assignment instructions. We also, when we bring people in for the induction training, explain to them what the emergency procedure should be, but there is a whole paragraph in the assignment instructions that they read and sign to say that they understand them. But you know what? When these situations occur, sometimes you don't remember all this stuff, okay? So the first thing they should do is call the control room and advise the controller of what's happening so he can start actioning the processes that need to be put in place, to safeguard the individual, because obviously we have a duty of care to the individual that we employ, and also to the member of public and the customer also.
So, all right. Yes, I mean, here's the situation. I mean, another thing from the comments here. And this brings me to the third scenario. We have now had the if you like, the benign situation where the security officer either stays and something bad happens across the street, or they go out and they make things worse, and that's fine. But now let's say in the scenario that they're actually lured out, that this, as we said, we have a thinking adversary that is creating a situation which is where there's an obvious moral choice, if you like, for the security officer. A woman in dire need seems to be, and let's go a bit, off color as it is, even an attractive woman and with some children and all those type of things that ticks the boxes of a security officer, that there's an obvious moral choice to be made. They go out, but it's a ruse, right? Is this something that you think happens? And if it does, how should we protect ourselves against that risk then, if you are all advocating for assisting?
Well, yeah, it happens all the time. There's the famous example of Batman and Robin getting on Buckingham Palace, the Fathers for Justice campaigners, and they created a diversion, which sucked. And these weren't security guards, these were police officers. They sucked them away so they could then get their ladders up and climb on ultimately to the balcony of Buckingham Palace. So it is a very common tactic used by criminals, terrorists, etc., and one that security officers need to be very careful about. That what's happening in front of them maybe a ruse to distract them or move them off post so that some other kind of negative action can occur. So it ultimately comes back to what Abbey's been saying, the importance of training. Good quality companies and guards go through these scenarios with operatives, perhaps even simulate them, and get them to a standard such that they can hopefully recognize these situations and respond accordingly.
But is such training feasible, Abbey? Is that the way to go, to have those simulations and that type of training?
It has to be feasible. It has to be feasible because, at the very outset of this conversation, I talked about a two-tier system, and it's a two-tier system we need to rectify, because what we have is security officers that are trained well, and then security officers that are trained to a substandard, because it's all about the charge rate, the pay rate, and the margin. Okay, and we as an industry need to get away from that. We need to have a level playing field for all of our security officers to be trained at the same level, providing a same quality of service to the customer. And then the customer is then determined by price, i.e. going to the supplier that is either giving them the best price or giving them the best package. But the security officer shouldn't be part of that process. They should all be, and I'll give you an example, London living wage. Okay, we have lots of contracts in London. Our staff, wherever possible, wherever we can negotiate with customers, we pay London living wage. So therefore, there's a level playing field for the officers in that area. That doesn't happen. We have, and I'll give you another example. I came across this week. Some of the larger security companies in this country are subcontracting their work, and it gets subcontracted not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times down the line. The person at the end of that line is then being offered cash in hand payments to work on a site. Okay. Now, first of all, they've been paid below minimum wage, and secondly, they're being paid cash in hand. What motivation is there for that officer to be committed to the job that he or she is doing? There is none. And there's no support for that officer, because a lot of these companies don't have control rooms, don't have supervisors, don't have investment in training. So we need to look at our whole industry and sort out the fundamental problems of our industry, and then talk about the specifics of training on level playing field.
I think that's an excellent point, but that point actually highlights. I see a dilemma here. One, you are both kind of advocating for there to be some sort of assistance, that life should be preserved if need be, and that there also should be a risk awareness coming from training and a rather extensive support system for the private security officers. But then you make it all kind of clear, Abbey, that this isn't always the case in the industry, that this support system and this training doesn't always exist. Without a doubt.
That's why I refer to our industry as being two-tier, because you've got those professional companies, and it's not about size. You can have a security company that employs 5 people being 100% professional. You can have a security company employing 20,000 people being totally professional. But unfortunately, that is not the case. I've been advocating for many, many, many years that we should start security companies, even the small ones, to give them the opportunity to improve on their standards. I've had this discussion with many different organizations, the BSIA, the SIA, and I've said we need to bring in the industry into the system, and where companies are small and don't have the funds to put all these things in place. Let's start at a lower level so they've got something to achieve and aim towards. And it's been an ongoing topic that I've been quite passionate about for many years. But that's how our industry needs to develop, and it needs to evolve. But at the same time, we need to stop the bigger players in the industry subcontracting their work out, where they know themselves that the person who's third, fourth, fifth down the list is getting paid below minimum wage, but they turn a blind eye to it. They turn a blind eye, and it creates bigger risk.
But turn to Mark then. You've obviously advocated for the increase of training, even by regulatory means. And do you think that if we stay with the ethical dilemma, the ethical challenge here, do you think that there should be part of the training mandated that that security officers should be trained officially and practically in how to weigh legal risks versus moral risks?
Yes, I mean, I think. Sorry, my son passed there. I think ethics should be part of training. If you look at any profession, from doctors, lawyers, etc., they have ethics as part of their training and as part of their, assessment. And security is something that I have always advocated as something that should aspire to be a profession. And if that's the case, you need to have ethical training. And it's very clear that there are lots of dilemmas that security operatives face where ethics is quite important. So no, I think this is an important area that should be covered.
Let's look at it from a different perspective then. Let's look at it from the buyer perspective. Now, the client perspective. To what extent are they aware of the fact that we all seem to be in favor of security officers actually leaving their posts? Are they aware of that? I'm going to Abbey first here. It's obviously difficult to see.
Look, in the real world, the customer, the client, is interested in his site and his risks. Very few customers I know would say you're quite happy for you to leave the site and attend to a situation. They are paying us to be there to protect their premises and their property. But as an individual, I have a moral obligation to protect life. So what I'm saying is that if it was a genuine situation and not somebody trying to create a diversion, then we should protect life and we will deal with the consequences after the situation. Now, what I've said before, and I'm repeating myself, if it's done properly, if there's proper support in place, then the risk is minimized because the control room puts certain procedures in place to protect the site that the officer is working on and protect the individual as well while they are attending to this. So it's not just about the individual leaving post and going off and dealing with the situation. It's about the individual being protected by the control room for the company he works for, this mobile supervisor. There's a whole array of management supervision structure that should be in place. And if it is in place, it minimizes the risks, both for the customer and the individual officer.
So follow-up question there, Abbey, really quick. Just, do you think a client should be able to stipulate that the security guard can, under no circumstances, leave that premise? I mean, no matter what. Yes,
they can, and it becomes a legal requirement because it's in a contract that's been signed by both parties to say that this is what we understand our job role to be on your premises. So a customer can. I mean, I may have a moral issue, but at the end of the day, if the customer is paying for a service, they need to be provided with that service. And ultimately, the assignment instructions are the document that is signed by the security officer, the providing company, and the customer to say that these are the instructions that we've given, and we all understand what the roles and responsibilities of these officers are. So if they want to put an instruction that says, you do not leave my premises for any reason, they are quite within their rights to do so. And legally, we are obliged to provide that.
Mark, what do you think about contracting away moral obligations?
What do you mean by that, Peter?
So, I mean, if I push this to its limits, right? So there's a person an inch away from your feet, but across a very particular line, right, in the sand. This is where your jurisdiction ends, and you have a very clear contract that says you are not allowed to act here. So you stand and watch them suffer. Is that something you think should this even be allowed?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. I think if it is a kind of life or death issue, I think personally, morally, myself, and it was very clear to me in my observations, that this person would potentially die without me potentially helping them, then I would inform the control room. I would say, there's a person dying in front of me. They seriously need my help. You need to get support here ASAP. And I would break the contract, to save life. But I think there's a difference between another kind of scenario which is not life threatening, a criminal incident occurring, a scuffle, a fight, those types of things, they're in a different category. I think protecting life is the most important.
Right.
Can I just add?
Yep.
That I actually agree with what Mark has just said. As human beings, we have a responsibility to protect life. Okay, we can have contracts that have got all sorts of things written in them, and we have to deal with the consequences. So if you didn't respond and somebody died, you have to deal with that consequence. And equally, if a customer's premise got broken into, we have to deal with that consequence. Yes, we have insurance cover. Yes, our insurance company will go ballistic for us breaking our contract. But if I was a security officer and I was in that predicament, and I weighed up the risk that this was not a diversion and a genuine situation, I would provide help to the individual that needed it. And I would advocate that to all of my staff without question, because life is paramount. And bricks and mortar can be replaced. So to me, as a human being, I totally agree with what Mark is saying. We have to put life first.
Can you just sum up what you're saying here, that in a few steps here, that we are kind of advocating for there to be some sort of assistance. I think that's the key here. That's the bottom line from both of you. It does, however, require two things. As I listen, it requires a certain amount of training and competence in actually being able to act and make those risks assessments. And once you've made the assessment, to be able to act correctly and efficiently. That's one thing. The second thing would be that there also seems to be a quite clear need for there to be a organizational structure to support you as a private security officer. And I think that, interestingly, both those 2 points that seems to be crucial for this to actually work are often lacking. And any comments on how to rectify that? The fact that there isn't perhaps enough training to make those risk assessments and to act correctly, and that many companies actually don't have that support that you mentioned, Abby. You can go first. How do we rectify these issues?
Look, there is lots of new technology that's available that is very cost effective in providing some of the support that we're talking about. We, as a company, provide an app, and on that app, it's like an aid memoir. So if you are in a situation where you have fire, flood, terrorist activity, emergencies like you've mentioned, basic first aid, they can click the app and it will give them pointers on what they need to do to safeguard themselves, the customer, members of the public. So that's using technology. So there are ways that things can be done at a reasonable cost. Okay, so it can be rolled out by all security companies, no matter how big or small. And I think there are other things that can be done too. So it's not all about having people come into classroom, having them trained up at high expense. There are other ways to do this, and technology has proven, certainly in the last 18 months, when we've all been sitting at home because of COVID, that technology works really, really well. And I advocate technology because it's A, cost effective, and B, easier to implement this sort of training than bringing people into a classroom scenario.
Mark?
Yeah, I would agree with Abby. I think there's a role for training, there's a role for technology, and we're doing this seminar online. There are so many ways now you can deliver training and simulations, etc., that we've learnt in the last 18 months. But regarding your point on infrastructure and minimum standards there, I think that is an important issue. And obviously, I know this is an international audience and kind of the focus on, obviously, we're from the UK. And I think, one of the gaps is the lack of compulsory licensing of companies and some of the standards you could put in place there to get rid of, some of these sharper operators that don't have much of an infrastructure. And ideally, I would like to see some compulsory licensing of companies with minimum standards, but in such a way that it doesn't wipe out, the opportunities for people to come into this market. It's kind of like a graduated set of standards, but it at least, at the very least, stops those sharp operators that don't have any kind of support and infrastructure. I think that's an important gap in our regulatory system.
Abby, I mean, from your perspective of actually having owning and running a security company, would you welcome such regulation?
Yeah, I agree with Mark. I mean, I've been an advocate of having mandatory ACS in the UK for many years. I mean, and I've had discussions with the SIA about starting it at a lower level so that it captures the people that haven't got the infrastructure, haven't got the funds to be at the level. Because you know what, being ACS is not cheap. We pay thousands, tens of thousands of pounds every year to be ACS, to have the SIA come out and audit us, to prove that we are good quality companies. And not all companies can afford that. And I fully appreciate that. And I have suggested to the SIA that they should look at maybe a bronze, silver, gold type of setup where people can come in at the bronze level, at a much lower level, less regulation, less cost, and build up as their businesses grow into silver, gold, and platinum, if that's how they want to do it. The SIA is governed by the Home Office. The Home Office doesn't have the parliamentary time to make changes in order for this to happen. But I do know that through secondary legislation, there are changes that can be made by the Security Industry Authority to bring some of this stuff in. And I've had discussions with them about that.
So let's turn around then. We obviously seem to be kind of in favor of increasing regulation and kind of driving it that way, but it could be different tiers. But what if we would drive it from again, from the buyer perspective, from the client perspective? What if they said, I want to have guards that are trained in a certain way, that have an oversight that perhaps mimics some sort of regulatory framework, but that's a demand coming from the buyers? Abby, how would you think about that?
We have that now. We have buyers that will say to us, we want to know what your ACS score is. We want to know that you're ACS. We want to know that you're NSI Gold. And these are all standards within the industry that are obtainable by most security companies, because it's not determined by size, it's determined by quality. So this is already happening. However, there are lots and lots of buyers that don't have the information, expertise to know these different types of registration, and therefore don't ask for them. And unfortunately, in our industry, we are still governed by price. So a lot of buyers will still go for the cheapest option without understanding the risks. And I've come across customers, potential customers, that have gone for cheapest option. I've said, do you understand what you've bought? Do you know what the risks are to what you're doing? And they don't understand the risks. Because if you, for argument's sake, if you had a security officer being paid cash in hand, who's insured the officer to be on site? The company can't get insurance cover. If they're self-employed, yes, they can get their own insurance cover, but it's so expensive as an individual to get. Why would you? Why would you get it? You're not going to pay thousands of pounds to insure yourself. So there are risks within the industry, and it's educating the buyers that we need to be doing, as well as educating the security officers, because some of the security officers don't understand, working for a security company that's paying them cash in hand, what are you losing? Cash in hand, you don't get your holidays, you don't get your sick pay, you don't get your pension. These are benefits you lose out on when there is actually no excuse to work for these sorts of companies, unless you have something to hide, obviously. Because if you have an SI license, then you have the right to be in this country, you have the right to work, and therefore you should work for the companies that are paying you at minimum wage or above. Why would you want to work for somebody paying you less than that?
Mark, any comments on that? Otherwise, I think I have a final question, basically, and that it goes something like this. We obviously have, first aid training is all more or less mandatory, right? I mean, as I say, if you do have a SIA license, you would have the training, and there are obviously those that are unregulated that they could slip this net. But should there also be a part of this, perhaps part of the SIA license, ethical training? Should there be ethical training as part of, just like first aid training or any type of training? Should there be ethical training as part of this, of the regulation, if you like, and part of that package? Mark?
Absolutely, yes. And I think it sort of goes into kind of not just ethical training, but difficult scenarios that may not necessarily involve ethics, but that security guards are invariably going to be faced with. So yeah, absolutely. This is a kind of in the context of resources, it's a resource that is much larger than the police in this country and many other countries, that plays a very important role to society, and we should maximize its potential. And I think through training, that is the means to do that.
Abbey?
I 100% agree with what Mark has just said. I mean, we need to drive standards up. We need to have training. Ethical training needs to be part of that, as well as anti-bribery training and all the other training that we should be doing. It's a whole process of things. I mean, we make sure that our officers are given not just this sort of training, but mental health training, so that they understand if they're feeling vulnerable or if they're feeling, especially in the last 18 months, it's always fallen to the individual company to decide what they feel is best for their staff. There hasn't been a professional structure, and that's what we lack in this industry. There needs to be structure and standards that we should all be providing to our officers, to our frontline officers, and that's the basis to work from. And I've always advocated that even if you start with something which is not the whole story, but getting them started at chapter 1, if you like, of a book, and working them through to the end over a period of time, that's better than not doing anything at all.
Well, thank you very much for those answers, both of you. I think we've highlighted quite a few interesting points, and I think we all agree that there are challenges, ethical ones, for the frontline security officer to resolve. Let's just see if there are any final questions from the audience that we would like to address directly to any of the panelists here. We have an agreement here that there should be ethical training, and as this is an important role, and I think we all agree with that. Right. So if you do have any questions that you would like to ask, please put them in either the Q&A or as most people have done today in the chat. It's fine. We'll work those too.
Can I clarify something for you, Peter?
Yes, please.
While you're waiting for your questions to come in, I don't want any buyers that are on this Zoom call to think I'm targeting buyers. What I'm saying is that buyers are professional people, but sometimes buyers, because they've got pressures of cost, look at cost more than they look at everything else. That's not to say they all do it, because I've got professional buyers that look at quality of service and price is secondary. So I don't want anyone to sort of be out there thinking, he's slating all of us buyers. I'm not. I'm saying that buyers need to ask the questions about the service, the officers, as well as the price.
That's a really good point. And I think the key here that we've highlighted is the need for adequate training to be able to make the correct choices, basically. And that includes ethical training, but also obviously risk assessment, and be able to act according to whatever is needed, and have that confidence and confidence in your competence, I would say. And then apart from that, also to have some sort of a support infrastructure within the organization itself. I think those two are key, and that the buyers, yes, they should definitely ask for this and make sure that these things are in place, or to what extent they are in place, and the extent they need them. Mark, any final comments?
No, I think we've covered all the issues. It's a kind of it's good that you're debating this issue, because I think it's a kind of under discussed area in security. So this is a good starting point, I think.
Great. Well, thank you both for your participation. And as you can see in the chat, should you have any further questions, now my kids are. If you have any further questions that you would like to ask that you can kind of think of, the second that we shut down this session, you just email those to hello@ifpo.uk, and we will continue the discussion offline. You also have our contact information available if you'd like to send us any emails directly or questions, and we will be happy to continue the conversations. And with that, I thank you all for attending, particularly the participants and obviously everyone in the audience, and have a beautiful day in the heat if you're in the UK. Thank you.